Hey there. So this is a Patron's exclusive video. I asked a couple of you guys online what subjects you want me to cover, and I got a few bits of feedback. The one that got the most votes from two of my student patrons was drawing techniques, how to get a cleaner line, controlling shading issues with technique, and the details and comments. Steven mentioned that he was having issues with getting consistency using line weight in a meaningful way. He also asked about some other stuff, which I'll get to in a separate video, but I thought I'd keep it simple, try to keep it short that way. So first of all, just general line control, the things that I find that impacted the most consistently across the board, and I think this comes into using line weight in a meaningful way, as Dave put it, has to do a lot of the time with rushing into something before you've had a chance to think about it. So it's particularly true with comics, in that people often ask about how long things take to do, and I think the most consistent response I have when I think about it is the doing isn't necessarily always the longest part. It certainly takes time to get work done, but the thing that takes the most time is planning, and the thing that leads to the most maturity in your art and the most care in the quality of the work is how much you think about what you're going to do before you do it. It doesn't mean necessarily staring at the paper for hours or making huge plans, but before you execute a line or do a piece of work, just the simple process of thinking about what you're going to do before you do it has a huge impact on the quality of your sketchy line, but also your finishing line, and particularly when it comes to line weight and intention. So I had a student in class today, this is relevant, or not today, I should say 2 days ago, in Intro to Cartooning at Sin Studio, that also had similar issues in that they were doing a classic thing. They wanted feedback on how a figure they were drawing looked, and they had done, I'll do it in red because I think that shows with the camera better, done a torso of a character that they were thinking about designing based on a YouTuber, and the character was sort of lean, fairly well built, wearing jeans and no shirt. What I'm doing right now is how I would sketch out essentially what they showed me. My cat is annoyed that I have closed the door. And the thing about what they'd done is that there wasn't particularly anything wrong with it. It was pretty good. But like a lot of novice artists, they had a lot of self-doubt. So they'd gotten to this stage, and then they had kept roughing. So I'll do one arm in the manner that I saw it by the time I got to them. And what this sort of speaks to is more not an expression of thoughtfulness, but of anxiety, of uncertainty, of being not secure in confidence of your own work, and just restating the line over and over and over and over until you end up with this really thick mass. And I'm not even pressing half as hard as they did, so they ended up actually getting it to be like this kind of thing. I think you get the point. I'm not going to do it to the whole thing because I think it also illustrates what I think you should do, which is keep things light and loose. If you want to change the shape of this pec, do it with one light line, revise a little bit. But don't keep working it. If you find yourself in that state, well, you've been working mindlessly or working anxiously. In either case, it is possible to walk it back. So rather than erasing hard, which you can do, but first thing I would encourage you doing is take a kneadable eraser and roll it into that shape, and then just roll it on the page. And do so for a bit. You'll find right away that the lines get lighter. Where it's worked in a little bit, then you can do this. But I don't want to totally erase what I did, so I'm going to be sort of a daubing motion and the rolling motion. The combination of those two, you can lighten the line quite a bit. Additionally, I really encourage the use of working with color erase because it allows you to go switch to a darker color and pull out the line you liked. If you've just gouged into the page and left an imprint that shows into the next sheet, it might be difficult to get rid of it. But this is a classic example of something where you want to think about, with intention, what you're doing, and not just be driven by anxiety. Be attentive to what you're doing in the moment. If you're starting a drawing, look at reference. If you're basing it on a real figure, as this character was, go look at the real figure, consider how you're going to draw them, plan a little bit in advance. Maybe don't just draw arbitrarily a figure. One of the other things about the drawing that I saw is it was at the edge of the page like this, in a corner, some strange compulsion to save paper or something. I think, think about what they're doing. Don't just make them standing there doing nothing. If you're just initially planning how a character looks, maybe, but even then, when you're designing a character, you want to think about personality, not just the physical state of them. Who are they? Are they, very serious? Are they sort of a jaunty character? Think about posing them in a way that represents how they might stand. I don't actually know who this character was, who this YouTuber is, but based on YouTubers that I do watch, I kind of think a pose like this would have made sense. So notice I'm using a very light gestural line at this stage because I'm just thinking about planning out how they're standing and where things are. I'm doing semi-constructive drawing, but I'm using it in a very gestural kind of way. When you're having a character talk, so you think about the shape of their jaw, rough in where the eyes and mouth are, to the upper lip, to the bottom lip, and then think about how much that means the jaws drop down. And then adjust. As opposed to committing to a jawline before you've decided to draw the mouth and how wide open it is. So I've got him doing something that's in keeping with his character, so I can think about his body language, the way he expresses himself. And now that I've got the roughs in, I'll do a little more to finish off the legs. I want to think about a couple of things. Line weight, there are to review, there are three general logical reasons to change the weight of the line if you're not doing a clear line style, long clear. There are to express the form. And so like one rationale for that is on a human body or an animal where the bone is close to the surface, you'd make a thin line. Where there's lots of muscle, a thick line. But you can also do things like if you want to really express how bulging a pec is, you'd have more thickness here where the muscle is pushing out. Or you could even go the other way and think like, oh, well, I want this bicep to really feel like it's bursting through the skin. So I'd have a thicker line here and a thicker line here and a thinner line at the top, so that it feels like the muscle is just stretching the skin to making it thinner, trying to get out. Either way, these are kind of, those are somewhat subjective, but you kind of have a rationale for the thinking behind why the line goes from thick to thin to thick, or from thin to thick to thin. The other one is light source. Now he's talking to himself. We're going to assume he's lit from this direction somewhat. So I want lines on this side of the body to be thicker and heavier, and lines on this side of the body to be thinner. They could still do this, but relatively speaking, overall, they'd be heavier over here where they're in shadow. So then we're expressing light and dark. And then ultimately there's distance. So if there's a figure far off in the background, I would give them finer lines. That does two things. One is it helps sort of suggest the idea of atmospheric perspective. Distance makes things fainter, so thinner lines. But also with a figure that's so small, if I've got lines that are that thick, if I put really heavy lines on them, the lines sort of dominate the drawing and you don't have any room for details. So it also works in your favor in terms of having some nuance to this little figure if I don't overdo it with heavy lines. So thinner lines for distance, and thicker lines as they get closer to the camera, as though the lines grow with proximity. So now that I've got everything roughed in and you understand the logic behind what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch to in this case, a soft pencil, which I'm going to sharpen just a little bit, and use in lieu of inking, which I recommend if you're still learning and practicing. But I even do this, like when I worked in animation, I did a lot of animation cleanup just in pencil, and then you would photocopy it, and that would drop out. I would use a light blue like that, light blue color erase pencil, and then switch to a soft lead and do a cleanup line like I'm about to do now. And then when I photocopy it, the end result would look kind of like an inked drawing. And that's how a lot of animation work was done when I worked in traditional 2D animation. So I've got a bright light source on this side of them. So my line weights are partially going to express the idea of that bright light source. I'm also going to play with the idea of what I talked about, the muscle. And then in interior features, like I'm doing in the face right now, I generally use finer, more delicate lines to express them than I do for outside contours, so that the contour lines have a heavier weight and help define form. So this line's facing that way. I'm going to make it a little thinner. Not a lot. I don't want a radical change in weight. Something you don't want to see is have like a really heavy line immediately transition to a very fine line. It's too graphic an effect. You want to have some nuance in that transition so that it's gradual. And then the whole proximity idea, there should be a sort of a family resemblance between all the lines on this figure. They're in the same ballpark of weights. I was mentioning this, doing cartoon characters with sort of thick sausagey fingers. There's a reason why you often see 3 fingers, because it makes it easier to do the thick sausagey fingers and not have the hand feel crowded. So that's relatively thinner than this side. It's not super thin. Still belongs to the same figure, and then inside the figure I'm going to use a thinner line even yet still. And then some very thin lines suggesting a bit of hair. So, heavier line on the shaded side of the body, and finer line on the light side of the body. This is a shaded side of the arm, so it gets a bit of a heavier treatment. That's actually even a little too heavy, but I'm going to leave it alone for now. Don't stop and erase and correct everything as you go, because it might be when you're done that it falls in fine overall and doesn't need revision. And if it does need revision, you can always go back and fix it. Thin line at the point of the bone. I'm going to augment this curve. Oops, that was a bit too much. Well, no, I'm going to put hair in there, so that's fine. So I'm going to augment this muscle by making the line heavier there and then going thin. Even though I used the thinness here to suggest the bulge of the muscle on the shoulder and the bicep. You don't want everything to be described by lines, so I'm trying to pick and choose where I actually use a line per se, because in a minute I'm going to switch to a different technique, and you'll see why. Just some scribbles for wrinkles, sort of roughing in what the jeans look like. Too big with that side of the pants, so bring it in a little. Oscar's quite offended that I closed the door on him. So, I think you can sort of see how this is going in terms of the why and where I use the thick and thin. You'll see that most of my strokes are pretty fluid. I'm not doing a lot of etching. I use that when I want something to look hairy or rough. Anytime you want a smooth line, you want a smooth, clean stroke. Sometimes if I'm being super precise, I will do a lot of exacting work on the pencils, but I don't want to get into the habit of tracing them, so I try not to do that. Generally what I do is try to get all the problems solved in my pencil drawing, and then pull the line I like out of that in the finishing, the cleanup. So now I'm going to switch to my side technique. I'm going to use the side of the pencil, and actually I'm going to switch to a harder lead because I want a little more nuance. And now I'm going to shade forms. So now I'm thinking about contours and pulling out three-dimensional aspects of the forms. So I'm using a sharpened lead and the flat side. I prefer a machine sharpened lead for this. You can do it with a tool sharpened, like a blade sharpened lead, but you'll want to wear it on a piece of paper to get a smooth surface first, because otherwise you'll end up with rough edges and they'll put lines in your shading. Drop shadow from his face. So this technique I'm doing right now, I'm using it pretty rough and fast, but the idea is that I can use strokes or scumbling, which is when you go in circles, to create a very smooth blended shade. Scumbling or strokes, if I use strokes I often kind of mix directions, and it can give me a very nice even tone that has minimal texture unless I want it there by just controlling and pressing a little harder. The texture tends to be a byproduct of the grain of the paper. So right now I'm using some simple bond from my printer, 8.5 by 14 bond paper, which is a nice sketching paper really. For just simple sketching, it's perfectly good. I use Bristol a lot, but mostly for more finished inking work, because Bristol takes a lot of ink without bleeding. But for my rough sketching, I use Bond and a variety of other cheaper papers for pencil drawing. A lot of my penciling is done over thumbnails that are printed out in light blue and blown up on my printer, so that's all often on Bond. So and a general level of tone, fill, and I think you can see how that cleans up. So it's fairly quick, and what I would do at this point is stop and look and think, and maybe enhance and revise, clean up weights where they need them. If I was using ink, and I might have situations where there's more weight than I want, if I spot that, so say, I think upon consideration, I do still believe that this line is a little heavy for that moment. And this one's a little too light, so I'm going to go in and just finish that. There we go. So I always make sure it's working. Usually not usually on a scrap piece of paper, but I'm just going to do it right on the page here. Before I apply it, I get it flowing. And then I go in and I'm lightly shaving. I don't want to press hard because that's when it'll blob. I'm just using the whiteout that's on the tip. If I was using a white brush, I would be just using the tip of the brush to shave it down. And I don't worry about if I get a little off, because especially with lead, it's quite easy to go back in and refine. So I'd probably keep doing that for a bit. A lot of using line weight with intention. It's also, you know, as I've said, it's at first thinking about things like where is your light source and honing lines to reflect that. But it's also allowing for the revision process, and after the fact going in and tweaking it, getting it to all fall in line, to follow your plan. A little bit too much about that, so now I'm going to go in here. And the techniques I'm showing right now are very much out of how I did work on Wayne Head and Eek the Cat and Salmon Max. Although Salmon Max was actually more of an inking job, but still, even though I was using a brush and ink there, a lot of the rest of what I was doing was a lot like what I'm doing right now. Just honing and shaping the lines. So it's getting that thinner because it's on the light side. This side of his palm feels cramped. And get rid of that. So yeah, hope that helps clear up some ideas about how this works. So remember, your line weights reflect direction of light source. They reflect expressions of mass, and you can kind of come up with your own hack for that. The models or theories that I follow are the classic one where the bone is on the wrist, for example, it's thinner. Where the meat gets heavier or bulkier, you get thicker lines. Where the elbow is, you get a thinner line. But then, like I said, you can also think with the idea of like, well, the muscle is really pushing against the skin, so it gets thinner and thicker on either side of where the muscle is. Both work. I would use that example, for example, with like someone with a beer belly, right? I'd have a thinner line out here because the skin's being pushed out, and then a really thick line on the bottom to kind of suggest the mass or weight with the gut hanging down. So there's like that force going out and gravity pushing down, and both are being expressed by aspects of how the line changes weight. And then overall throughout the form, the light source can still work with that. They both can go together. And then the third factor is distance, and having lines get finer as they move further away, so that figure in the distance there would end up with little lines like this. So that he both is visible, like the details in the face there would get lost if I was using weights like that. But also the sense of scale and distance is enhanced by the fact that the lines have gotten finer along with the scale of the figure shrinking down. So you keep those ideas in mind, and then use the values accordingly. And then always remember that you can go in and edit and revise and clean it up. A lot of intentionality is editing after the fact. So in terms of sort of a meaningful assignment of values to line weights, you try to plan as much as you can up front. Think about light sources, think about what approach you're going to use, and then absolutely remember that you can always go back and revise and edit and tweak, which it means at both ends of the drawing there's a moment where you sit back and look at it and think about, what am I going to do? And now that you've done it, what am I going to do to tweak this and get it to where I want it to be? All right, hope that helps. I'll try to work on another one about some of those other things Steve asked about, and a couple other topics to have posted for you all very soon. Take it easy and enjoy your drawing.
Nights go by like fireflies, running